Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of ClueCon Weekly. Joining us this week is Emily Omier, a consultant helping open source startups monetize, grow, and find community and revenue growth. And first of all, Emily, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
I feel like your job and what you do is very interesting to the community. We very often bring up this very topic on the podcast. Like, okay, I have a great project. That what do I do now? And it's very important to have someone who actually knows and has a roadmap. So, well, would you like to start by giving us a quick introduction about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So, like you said, I work with open source startups on positioning and monetization strategy. And what I do is, so one of the things I find really interesting about open source companies is that they always have this tension between needing to make revenue and then also having a community that having a free project that they also need to devote resources to. And to me, this is both a challenge and an opportunity for open source companies. And what I help companies do, um, to a large extent, it is manage that tension. But it is also about positioning the project itself, sort of the entire company inside of the ecosystem that it exists in. So one of the things that I think a lot of company founders and open source maintainers really struggle with is figuring out how to differentiate their project or their company from everything else in the ecosystem and how to talk about it so that people understand what the project is. Um, I would actually say that this is a problem in the open source ecosystem because it doesn't hurt just maintainers of projects when a user doesn't understand quickly what the project is about, they end up wasting time. Basically, they have to like actually use the project in order to discover if it works for their use case or not. So that wastes everybody's time, and ultimately, like, why is that bad? Because it gives open source like a bad name, a bad reputation. But for the open source companies, it makes it harder for them to build a company. And I would say, like, the goal of my work is to help open source founders build successful companies.
For sure, yeah. I think one important point we very often touch on is the fact that most founders of projects are technical. Like I will say, I will wager 90% of the open source projects that pop up on GitHub are one developer, two developers, three developers, and they're developers. So they have the same problem, whether it's a startup or whether it's a proper open source project that is okay, we have something that's good
Mhm,
and yeah, it's great, and you should use it, but then you don't get past that point.
mhm.
So I feel like the first thing I would like to ask you is how do you figure out a way to support your project? So you have usually the state. Let me tell you where I come from. I've been part of many open source projects. Some of them very successful, like Priswitch, which is the base or second was based on. Others lived on for a few years. Then everybody's sort of moved on to their own jobs, and they're sort of sitting there. Some people still use them, and but the idea is how do you make sure a project can survive and make revenue? Like, how do you find a revenue model that makes sense?
So, first of all, you could never insure anything. Sometimes I make
Oh
this
yeah,
point to
that's
my
right.
client.
Oh,
There are no guarantees in life, and there are no guarantees in business. What you can do is you can increase the chances that this project is going to survive. And yes, you've actually touched on something, which is that to me, financial sustainability is a really critical part of project sustainability. And this is actually why I think the open source ecosystem in general should become more comfortable talking about money, because there are some people that are like real hippies. And honestly, this is probably why I'm interested in open source because I have that in me, right? The I have the hippie in me. Um, but so I get it, but on the other hand, like, people need to put food on the table, and, most developers have the option, if they want to get jobs that, like, pay fairly well. And if a project is just like a volunteer hobby, it's always going to be the first thing that you stop doing when you need more money or you have less time in your personal life. So, if you want to talk about sustainability of projects, you have to talk about financial sustainability and financial sustainability, like on a personal level. Are the people who are contributing or maintaining this project able to pay their bills, and, still have time for the project? Um, there's also an element I actually think of independence. So, one model that can work pretty well for open source projects is to be basically hosted by a company that does something that isn't directly related to the open source project, but they have some sort of reason that they are going to support this project. So, maybe you are a music streaming service like Spotify and you create a Kubernetes platform like Backstage. Um, but like Spotify isn't a Kubernetes company, it's a music streaming platform. So this example is going to fall apart because I think like if I understand correctly, like Backstage may be on the road to becoming its own company.
Mhm.
But anyway, the point is that's a really common model, right? You have a project that is hosted by a company. I think, like, let's go back to this idea of like open source hippies. If you're the maintainer of a project who works at Amazon, you are working for the man. If you do not want to work for the man, you need to figure out a way to monetize your project on your own. For the record, there's nothing wrong with working for the man,
Mhm.
and I know a lot of people that work for Amazon. But if you are the kind of person who's like, "No, I don't like, I wanna be a independent open source maintainer," you need to figure out how to monetize it. Um, there's also, like, different ways that you can talk about monetizing open source projects. You can be a single person, and you can have a project that is important enough to enough people that they're gonna pay you a couple $1,000s a month to help them with it. You're able to make, the equivalent of what you would make at a day job. You're happy, you're independent, everything is great. Or you wanna build, like, a venture-backed company and build a unicorn and have an IPO and become the man. That's also
Mhm.
awesome, right?
Yeah.
But you have to start out and be like, what is your goal, right? Also, what is your goal? What's realistic for the type of project that you have? And then talk about monetization models. I want to note actually that my specialty is positioning. It's kind of expensive to work with me, so I don't usually work with the individuals
Yeah.
who just want to be like remain solo. However, positioning is really important, whether you're the person who's just going to be like independent, charging a couple of clients a couple grand a month, or if you're going to build a venture backed company and you know go make billions of dollars, have an IPO, and build a giant company. Whichever of those you're doing, you have to think about the same tension between your revenue and your community offering. You have to think about your positioning. You have to be able to accurately describe what your project is, and you have to make people understand what the value of paying money for something related to your project is, for whatever your commercial offering is. So, what value are they going to get if they pay you that they don't get from just using your free open source project?
Yeah, that's a very common conversation we have with open source maintainers, including people who are actually angry at companies that are using their open source project without paying them or even recognizing them in some cases. It's a it's a push and pull relationship. Like it's always going to be like that. You should not ever use the open source. Some people say, but then we'll go nowhere if we didn't. So it's very hard to find the position. So I want to ask you an interesting thing that popped up. You mentioned solo people you usually work with because, of course, it's a consultancy, so you work more for larger companies. What if you are a solo developer? Which growth paths do you see to get to the point where, so you see your project is promising, but you have a day job and you can only do so many hours. And how do you have you seen people manage to make it from one person to a company?
I mean, there's bootstrapped, open source companies out there. I mean, Nextcloud, Percona, um, Open Project, Artifactual. I'm listing like a tiny, tiny, tiny percentage of them. There's lots of them. I would say there's undoubtedly more bootstrapped open source companies than there are venture backed. Um, but you don't like nobody's writing news articles about them because they have like well, that's just like it's big and it's sexy when there's like lots of money and from VCs like flowing around. Um, some of these companies are like wildly profitable or, quite profitable. Um, so yes, like can you build a sustainable, profitable company from just one person to not just one person? Yeah, of course. There's tons of companies that have done it. What is the best path for doing so? That is gonna depend on what your market is like. So there's, and this is actually one of the really interesting ways that positioning plays with the open source, is if you look at your project, you wanna ask yourself some questions, and also you wanna ask yourself questions about what game you wanna play. So you can offer a cloud-hosted version of your project. Um, this makes you not exactly playing the same game as, like, any other, SaaS company, but that means, like, you're playing the open source SaaS game, right? You're gonna have a certain go-to-market model, that is gonna be because you have chosen to play that game. If you choose to offer support or services, um, that is a different game. There's
I have to
not
say that
one.
I like the approach. It's which is the approach that's sustainable. So yeah, just getting into maybe a little niche and then trying to grow out. And but it's never easy. I tried it a few times. That's why I'm saying with my libraries and projects.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's, like, none of these are necessarily easy, but, that's also another opinion that I have is this goes for entrepreneurship in general. You have to enjoy the game. If
Oh
you are
yeah,
not enjoying the game, you should get out of it. And I think that that message doesn't get spread enough. So choose a game that you're gonna enjoy.
yeah. Everyone is seemingly supposed to be a founder, an entrepreneur, a someone who goes to the cover of Forbes or whatever. While in reality, it's, I mean, you can be a great individual contributor in a company. It's just a different game.
Mhm. Exactly, exactly, and you have to be honest with yourself. The other thing is, um, building a company around your project is not the only way to, to spend time working on your project. So I did mention, like, you can work for a company that's gonna support the open source project. Um, the way that they support the open source project is by paying you to work on it. Um, In fact, I would say if your goal is to spend all of your work time, like, on this project, like, on the technical aspects of a project, that's the route that you probably wanna take. Because as soon as you start talking about, building a company, even as a technical founder, very quickly you start having to do stuff that is not like writing code for your open source project. You have to work with people like me who are who are going to help you with positioning, or at the very least, you have to think about that, right? Or you have to like spend your time interviewing people and hiring them, and then you have to fire them,
Yeah.
and like that's not fun for everyone. And so like, if I think it's really important point to make, like, if you aren't attracted by that aspect of building a company, There are other ways that you can spend time on open source, that is not like volunteer time.
Absolutely. Yeah, so let's assume you want to go down that path, because otherwise, again, there's many great things you could do. Another thing, you sent me a list of ideas and topics you usually touch on when you work, and what I'm really interested in is how do you get your first customers? This is a very big, not even I think it's the biggest problem I always get when I talk to people in my position as a sales architect. Sometimes I meet the very early stage startups, people with good ideas, etc., and they're always stuck with the same problem. Okay, this works, it's great, we like it, nobody's buying it. What strategies can you apply there?
So I want to preface this by saying, A, I'm not a salesperson, and B, I am not like a founder myself. So those things, keep those two things in mind. However, there's a couple of things. One, you have to talk to people. I think
Dude,
I think there can be among founders sort of a hesitancy to talk to their user base, um, just in general, and then people can also be very shy about doing anything that's salesy. Um, in order to get any customers, let alone your first customers, you have to talk to people, and the you have to also change your mentality because sales are an exchange of value. So, I go to the store and I buy a pair of shoes and I pay however much money I pay $100 for my shoes. Ideally, I should go away feeling like, yes, these shoes were worth $100, and the person who sold me the shoes is also happy to have sold the shoes. Um, the shoe salesperson was not, like, pushing me to buy the shoes. Oh, the other thing is, like, the shoe salesperson has solved a problem for me. I previously had crappy shoes, and now I have good shoes. So, when you are doing sales, you should think of what you're doing as solving somebody else's problem. The first step is understanding what problem somebody has that your project or solution could solve. That's the kind of work that I do. Um, because if you don't know that, if you don't understand that, yeah, it's gonna be harder. But at the very beginning, often actually you don't really understand. On the other hand, this is an advantage that open source companies have over others, because you have people that are using your technology. And that means you're not going in cold necessarily. You can talk to your users and ask them questions like, um, what could we change in this project that would make it something you would be willing to pay for? You have people that you can talk to and ask those questions, and that's really where you should start. I mean, if you're thinking like, I have an open source project, it's got some users. Now I'd like to, maybe get some customers. Just start by really talking to your users and asking them what would you be willing to pay for?
yeah, I think and you're very right that that is a real problem. Like, people don't sort of want to talk to customers, don't want to talk to users, and it is where it starts. Like, you can't substitute that. I
Mhm.
totally agree that there's no way around it. Great. So, any conferences you'll be speaking at in the near future, so people can come and listen to you?
Well, yes. So I'm organizing a conference
Oh wow,
on May 27th and 28th in Paris that is for open source founders. So if you are an open source founder, send me an email. Check out the website, which you can find either at opensourcefounders.com or 05f5.com.
nice. We'll
Um,
put that in the description.
Yes. So there's that one. I will be at FOSDEM, which is in 2 weeks, so I don't know how quick this publishes, and at State of OpenCon, which is right after FOSDEM. And after that, I don't have any conferences on my schedule aside from Open Source Founders Summit.
Nice. I love FOSDEM. I won't be able to join this year because of conflicting schedules with work travel, but it's one of my favorite events.
Mhm.
ClueCon in Chicago and FOSDEM in Brussels. So have fun. It's a great gathering. Well, go see Emily if you're
Cool.
there.
Yes.
It's gonna
Yes.
be
Yes.
yeah. I think FOSDEM is also good, a good point, a good place to go and look for maybe a co-founder or even just spread your message and see what sticks. Asking
Mhm.
people if they like what you've been doing. I've done that multiple times, and it's always because it's a lot of people and it's not very formal. So
Mhm.
usually you can just ask questions and people would just say, "I like this, I don't." It's a great. It's better than some other. The more commercial conferences are not as interesting for open source.
Exactly. Exactly.
And at FOSDEM, you get to see the real hippies.
Yes. Exactly.
There's plenty of them. I think Richard Stallman, uh, came to FOSDEM a few years ago. Has to be 10-ish. That was interesting.
I have no idea.
It's the
Yeah,
hippie
I
world
know.
champion, probably.
I do know there was a guy last year who didn't have shoes. Everyone was, like, looking at
Well, they didn't. Well, your example earlier could have been useful for him. Like you go to a store, you buy shoes, and being provided a service. Just now you have shoes. I guess they're opposed to the whole giving money for shoes thing.
Yeah, yeah. Build it your own.
Yeah, well, open source is like that, right? Open source shoes. Now that's the free
Exactly.
startup idea we gave you for the audience.
Well, that's actually really interesting because, open hardware is really fascinating. The sort of relationship between, open source and hardware in general and bringing more of an open source approach to hardware. I talk to companies occasionally that are either in the hardware space or, sort of adjacent to it, like they work very closely with, either they do middleware or they work very closely with hardware manufacturers. Um, and that I would say is not my specialty, but it's really fascinating. Open source is like very software focused, but there's more and more of a discussion about how it can apply to hardware. They're not shoes.
Yeah, there's a lot of open source shoes are probably not super interesting. Although who knows? Right? It's you never know. I think at some point the line between open source and just people putting plans online is blurred. Like is if you're putting designs for furniture online. I like building my own furniture on occasion. I have many pieces in my house that I
Mhm,
built myself when I have time, and those designs mostly came from the internet. Is that open source?
mhm.
Probably. Yeah, why not?
I mean, when it comes to software, like we, I, the other point that I think is important to make about open source is that open source is a legal concept, and what is an open source project? It is a software project that has an OSI approved license. What makes it open source is the license, and we can go on and on about community, blah blah blah, but like I do think like fundamentally it's a legal concept, and I think that's actually an important thing to recognize, because sometimes there can be sort of discussions about like what is open source. And to me, it's actually not that complicated. Again, like, is this a piece of software that has an OSI approved license? Yes, no. There's not really a blurry line.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. Probably. I mean, after all, in what my example earlier, the difference is just I don't know if the designs had an OSI approved license, but you could definitely release the
True.
designs with the right license, and that will truly be open source. That will be an open source table. Why not?
Yep,
It's not about it being software. It's about being open access of ideas and
that's true.
content. It's really interesting. Well, I'll see if I can get someone to release me open source table design for so I can properly build it without it's yeah. I think that just to drive the point home, many people don't know open source is not free. As in, if you're giving something out for free that is not getting money, it's just out there, is not necessarily open source. And vice versa, there are open source things that are not free, which is weird but possible.
Mhm.
It's not the same thing. So it's about the license, not about the fact that you're not getting money. I think what adds to the
Mhm.
confusion is the original definition of free software.
Yeah,
Like free
or
is
the problem is like the English language, right? Free has 2 different meanings, and in some languages, there's a different meaning for free as in freedom and free as in there's no cost. Um, but in English, it's the same word, so and there's an aspect of both in free open source software. And it's true. I know of companies who have a commercial product, they charge money for it, um, and it is completely open source. So it is not protected by the license. They cannot sue you if you hack the source code. You can see the source code. Um, you're not breaking any law if you hack it so that you can use it without paying them. They make a bet that you're not going to do that. Basically, that the kind of customers who would pay for it are just not going to do that, and it works for them. So that's a good example of like not free open source software that actually I think is a really interesting strategy.
that might sound silly, but many of those companies are in the security area because they
Mhm.
say our algorithms, our cryptography, whatever, is so good
Yep.
that we can publish the software so you can check that it's good. And still, you will be using our products because we run it a certain way. The algorithms are only part of the process, but if you're welcome to just use the algorithms yourself if
Mm.
you want to. It's there is
Yep.
there's a couple large ones who operate exactly in
W-
that way.
Which actually leads me to another point, which is if you're an open source company, it's a very good idea to be clear about what uh, your open source project is
Hmm.
contributing to your business. So I am not an open source hippie. I don't think that open source companies are like morally superior to non open source companies. I don't think there's they're not better. um, I do think that there are challenges and opportunities. So there's business reasons why you would want to have an open source approach, but it's not one size fits all. There's a menu of reasons why your open source project could contribute to your business. And one of them is transparency. So, if you operated in an area where you have really paranoid customers and they're the kind of customers that don't want to trust you, they want to verify, it can be really a really strong differentiator to just be able to say, look, our code is open. You don't have to like sign any like NDAs or anything like that to see our code. We're not going to put it in escrow for you. Just have a look, verify for yourself that it does everything that we say it does, and it doesn't do any of the things that we say it doesn't do. That can be a really strong differentiator, and that can be a value that your project provides for your company. I think it's also really important to note that if that is why the open sourceness, the fact that your code is open source is valuable for your company, the size of your community is irrelevant. And there are other modes, right, where the size of your community is very important. But if
Hmm.
the primary reason is that it helps you get through security reviews faster, you could have 0 free users and it would still be valuable for your company. So when you're thinking about your open source strategy and how you're going to devote resources, you want to know that because if your open source exists to get you through security reviews, you probably don't want to invest a huge amount of money in community building
Yeah,
because you're not going to
it's
get
not really a
ROI.
yeah, it's not really a thing. Like you don't at that point you have it out there just because people can't see it and pre-vet it.
Exactly, exactly. So, just be aware what is important for your company in its relationship to open source. So, everyone has limited resources. If you're an open source company, you've already got to spread those resources
Very thin.
thinner than everybody else. So, be very intentional about how you do it.
Cool. Yeah, yeah. I think it's again the whole getting an open source project to be sustainable through money. I think going back to your first point and something starting to recap for the talk. I think the idea is that money ultimately is the best way to keep your project alive. You're perfectly right. It's you can have, I've seen great projects with 30, 40 contributors that ultimately were making no money, who ran through very rough patches because people at some point just have something else to do and you don't really have time. And this month we're doing the certification, so we're working 12 hours a day in the company. And ultimately they just fell to the side of the road. Maybe not
Mhm.
completely, but so the reality is that making it sustainable goes through making money. So I think it's very valuable. What you're doing is very valuable, and I well keep doing it. And maybe maybe you help me someday. I still have a couple projects I really wanted to. I still want to revive, but it's never the right moment, right? So sometime. Cool. So
Sometime.
Emily, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Emily Omier is a consultant for a company. She helps open source founders position the project and find monetization models, community and revenue growth, and in general, help the project thrive. I think it's a very valuable contribution to the community. And reach out to her. We'll put a few links in the description so you can find her. Go say hello at FOSDEM. Go say hello at the Open Source Founders uh, conference. Which, by the way, I'm actually take a look and see if I can come join because it sounds really interesting. And well, again, Emily, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
And for the rest of the audience, I'll see you next week. Goodbye.